Welcome back, welcome back. Welcome to the first Live with Littlewood of 2022. A very, very happy new year to all of you. I'm back in London town. I wanted to escape to some sunshine over Christmas and was in search of some more sensible COVID rules as well. But I'm back, and what a month it's been in and around Westminster and across the world. We've got a crisis in Ukraine, which looks extremely serious, and we've had the wrong sort of political parties in number 10 Downing Street. I guess on the upside, the pandemic, Omi-conned, it's finally coming to an end, isn't it? To discuss all these issues and more, I'll be joined by a great panel of guests on this week's Live with Littlewood. Kaboom, kapow, welcome to this week's Live with Littlewood. With me, Mark Littlewood, Director General of the IEA. Well, we've got a lot to get through. We're back for 2022. This was supposed to be the quiet, peaceful year after all the turmoil of recent times. Not looking like that as we speak to you in January. Got a great panel of guests to help me navigate through the week's events, not just here in Westminster, but across the globe. Later on in the show, we'll be joined by the IEA's very own Jamie Whyte, our senior fellow here, and by the Henry Jackson Society, Alan Mendoza. He'll be talking us through what we should make of the Ukraine crisis and how that will unfold. But to kick off, to welcome two guests back to the show, the Independent's chief political commentator, John Rentoul, and pundit, commentator, and all-round good guy, Alex Deane. Welcome, guests. Great to have you here. Good to see you, John. Alex, great to see you. Well, I'm desperately looking for a free market angle on Partygate, right? Because I can't.
Nobody charged him for the cake.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I guess if the taxpayer paid for the cake, then I'm outraged.
Capitalist
from a
cake.
free market point of view. But it is actually interesting, I think, the unfolding events here, even from a free market, classical liberal perspective. You know, we at the IEA typically aren't that bothered about, you know, Westminster scandals and gossip unless they really affect the free market agenda. But, John, I'm going to start with you. Kind of a principal point. Is this basically, and I'm stretching here for a philosophy, about the rule of law? That the anger with the Prime Minister is one rule for him and his chums and a different one for the public.
And it's about his character, isn't it? But I mean, I think the free market angle is that it's exposed a deep fault line in the Conservative Party among Tories who think that Boris Johnson isn't a proper Conservative, that he isn't committed to the free market, that he is actually a Brexity Hezza, as he called himself, an interventionist, a high-spending, high-tax, centre-ground politician. And so there's a very much an ideological element to the attempt to get rid of him.
Alex, what's your take on it? Are you a Boris fan, a Boris detractor?
I think.
I can't believe you liking a Brexity Hezza. That's not in your DNA at all.
Well, I like the first part, but I think what John has said is right. But I think that the broader tribal thing about politics is that when people see someone on the blue team under attack from someone on the red team, then suddenly they rally together.
Well, we saw that today.
Exactly, and the noise made at PMQs in favour of the PM today, even from people who I know were critical of him up to this week.
Have put in their letters.
The turning, well, and I gather from Jonathan Gullis, some of them have taken them back. The turning point for the PM, for me, wasn't actually about the police announcement. That's just more heat. I'm not being dismissive of that. I'm just saying in terms of the narrative. The turning point for the PM was the defection. Because when a defection happened, we saw suddenly...
Everybody else rallied together.
Correct. And those people were out in spades today. For what? I mean, I know you play the game of expectations, but on a game of expectations, Keir Starmer today fell flat, and the PM exceeded what people were expecting.
John, how much does all of this matter? And one of the things I want you to help me with, you've been a Westminster watcher, expert for decades, and oftentimes people say, oh, this is just a bubble story. PMQs being a classic example. I remember William Hague being fantastic at PMQs, but it's
week after week.
In the wider public was the square total of sod all, right? What's the how's one supposed to judge when something, breaks out of the Westminster bubble into something that is engaging the general public who take a firm opinion on that it's the talk of the town in the Dog and Duck? Has this crossed that Rubicon?
Long ago. And for
why?
the reason that you said, actually, Mark, which is that people think that they thought that Boris Johnson was on their side. An awful lot of them, half the population, thought he was a leaver who understood their resentment of the establishment and the elite. And then it turned out that he thought he was an establishment elite person who was exempt from the rules that he actually imposed on everybody else, and people felt that very, very strongly.
Yeah, I thought it crossed your dog and duck test when Anton Deck talked about it on TV. That's when you know people are actually engaging with this beyond the Westminster bubble. They are not your archetypal Westminster bubble commentators. Correct. They are not closely examining the PAC review of whatever. No, I thought that was right. But on the other hand, I thought that there was an interesting thing about society at large looking at these regulations, and we've all been through the rules and suffered under them in different ways, but then most people think, is a cake the thing that's going to do for a prime minister? So on the other hand, it definitely has broken through the Westminster bubble and is a mainstream story, and then I think there are some people engaging with this saying, is that it? Mm-hmm. Is that what's going to do for a PM? And that's where I think the juggling's happening now.
Yeah, John, talk me through that as well, because I haven't bothered to look into it in great forensic detail, but of the kind of, and I hesitate to say this literally, but the crime sheet, because they're not necessarily crimes that's being investigated, but are there some elements of this that are sort of causing blind fury? I don't know, a garden party in which alcohol was consumed, that's sort of absolutely intolerable for the public, whereas 10 minutes of singing Happy Birthday might just be on the right side of the line?
No,
or is it the aggregate of it?
I think it's the whole thing. It's the idea that, a lot of people weren't working in an office. Downing Street regards itself as exceptional, and therefore people carried on working. And so even the fact that you did what you would normally do at work, which is, if it's somebody's birthday, you give them a cake. Mm-hmm. Even that just emphasises how different Downing Street is from the experience of everybody else. And also, of course, if you want to get into the detail, this was 30 people gathered from all different parts of the building, gathered in a room to sing Happy Birthday. Well,
of course, part of the problem is, while some people say it was 30, I saw George Eustace, member of the Cabinet, saying it was 10. So, the point is you've got different accounts, and those accounts have to be tested. And to the point, the conversation you were both having, there's a discussion now to be had about what was true and what was untrue, and we all, as Brits believing in the rule of law and freedom under the law and due process, would say that you've got to await the outcome. I know that people say government's hidden behind saying you've got to wait for Sue Gray's report, now you've got to wait for the Met Police's report, but on the other hand, we do believe that if there is a process of investigation, you've got to find out what the result is. And the thing I thought Labour had overshot on that was Angela Rayner yesterday saying in her urgent question, there are these very serious allegations being made, and the fact they're being made means the Prime Minister's got to resign. Yeah. And most people hear that and say, hang on, you've missed a step.
Wait a minute. The point is that the Prime Minister himself has admitted that work event, as he calls it, in the Downing Street Garden shouldn't have happened. He's admitted that was a mistake. In hindsight, he said. It was extraordinary. And Keir Starmer couldn't even land that insult today. But the Prime Minister has admitted that was a mistake, and just that one alone, I don't think you need the Sue Gray report, you don't need the police. That one alone is a bad enough misjudgment, I think.
I don't agree with that.
The Sue Gray thing, this has started to sort of irritate me. I don't have any axe to grind against Sue Gray, but I think all of these reports and investigations become a justification to not answer a question. I can't pass any comment until the Sue Gray report. It's not prejudicing a jury trial or anything like that. I understand in certain cases I can't say this because it might prejudice a trial. This has just become a reason to delay, and it's become a running joke. If my missus says, "Can you help with the washing up?" I'll have to wait until I've read Sue Gray's report and I'll get back to you then.
So that's fair. On the other hand, understand what's government supposed to do. I mean, is it supposed to be for a £100 fixed penalty misdemeanour notice? We're supposed to say we're having a judge-led inquiry. I mean, so, you know, short of that...
Well, I was saying that they should... John, would you agree that they should give an account in public, on television and in Parliament of what actually happened, rather than...
That's what Sue Gray is going to do.
But
Exactly.
why? I mean, but
So
you don't
you
need
should
to
wait
wait
for the results of her
her.
report.
Boris Johnson could do this on the Andrew Marr show, you know.
Well, no, because he hasn't gone round and interviewed all the civil servants, because he wasn't at all.
But he can get... my point is, he's not giving his account.
No, but it's an attempt at impartiality, because if they did that and he appeared in front of Marr, there would be certain people who say, it was very difficult for us to believe, of course, but there are certain people who say, I'm afraid I don't believe the Prime Minister. Well, it's a shocking idea.
Yeah.
Right, so I need somebody a bit more impartial.
I want to come on to some of the other problems affecting the government, John, that you highlighted in a minute, but just to understand the I guess we would look at it from the IA side, the dysfunction of the state. There was a great article on politicalbetting.com. No prizes for guessing, that's one of my favourite websites, politics and betting. 10 stages of mishandling a crisis. I'd like your guys' thoughts on whether this is right. 1, turn a blind eye. 2, think it doesn't matter. 3, refuse to believe it. 4, accept that something has gone wrong but insist that it's limited to 1 or 2 bad apples. 5, deploy a legalistic argument for why things are not as bad as they appear or will blow over. 6, a limited inquiry and or staff shake-up. 7, protect the boss. 8, the non-apology apology. 9, a more extensive investigation. 10, resignation.
Well, we're at 9 at the moment.
We're at 9, and do you think we'll get to 10?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think Boris Johnson is going to give up. I think he's going to be got out by the Conservative MPs. And in a way, none of... obviously the details do matter, but what we'll do for him in the end is that this is a moment at which Conservative MPs have to decide. They have to decide, do they want to be led by Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak, and I think they will decide they want to be led by Rishi Sunak.
And I don't, and I think that the Labour Party's helped make up their mind by taking a defector that people looked at and thought, well, up yours then, we'll stay with the guy we've got. But I thought that, first of all, I agree with you that we're at 9, and second of all, I thought it was an interesting list of 10. To which I would add a 0, which is know about the problem before it becomes public. And that's where government has fallen down.
Yeah. OK, well, that's enough sort of Westminster tittle-tattle. I want to pick up on John's...
This is the future of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I guess. Yes, but as you can change the deck chairs on the Titanic. No, it's not. It is important, clearly. But I was really interested, John, in your point about when these things come to a head. Are they really sort of ciphers for other gripes and concerns? If you're a Conservative MP who believes that the government has been too interventionist, jacking up taxes rather than lowering taxes, hasn't made the most of converting us into Singapore upon Thames post-Brexit and the rest of it, and you have these, genuine ideological, philosophical policy grudges, is it then used as a kind of excuse rather than actually saying, I want to change the Prime Minister? I think Rishi Sunak would be a bit more low tax. It actually requires a kind of inflection point like this for that change to be made.
Well, I think there's an awful lot of punk Thatcherism around. I think there's
great term.
There are a lot of Conservative MPs
who
have a really, really simple idea of what conservatism is, that it's low taxes and small state under all circumstances. Whereas actually, Rishi Sunak, who is a proper conservative, recognises that this is a crisis, and that what Margaret Thatcher would have done in a crisis, and what she did do in 1979 was put taxes up. And she believed in sound money and sound public finances, and that's what he believes in. So there's an awful lot of idiocy in the Conservative Party at the moment, but it's dressed up as ideological.
What do you think, Alex? How sort of riven is the... And then do you tend to get in politics that there are moments, around what sound like quite trivial things like a birthday cake that are really just the battle of arena for what are ideological divisions in any given political party or government?
Well, speaking as a punk Thatcherite myself, and as someone captured by the idiocy that John describes, I'm in favour of a small state, low tax response.
And also, I agree. I'm signing up to the punk Thatcherite band as well.
If those are the brickbats I must accept in response for my position, then I accept them. Because I do think that in order to stimulate an economy in a crisis, a tax cut's a good idea, especially if you've
Well,
basically given up on the idea of debt. Yeah, but this is a government that's given up on the idea of debt.
Right, you're punk Keynesians. You actually think let's cut taxes, borrow more, and just pump money into the
Well, we
economy.
might rely on the Laffer curve
You're
argument.
all mad.
Yes, well, Mark's already said my
Laffer
point.
curve
That I think that for the time being,
But we probably cut spending, right? I mean,
As
Alex
well,
and I.
yes.
Yeah, we cut spending if you're to
Well,
get
where are
down
you
the.
going to cut spending?
Well,
department?
blimey, where? I
Where
can
wouldn't
barely
I cut-
think
where
of an
wouldn't-
area where
where
I
wouldn't
wouldn't
I
cut
cut spending?
spending.
But
I mean,
even-
that needs to be done in a comprehensive way. I'm not saying that, but I think Alex and I would both support the government spending less money. I mean,
Correct.
As well as pumping loads of money into the economy at the same time. I mean, just brilliant economics.
Well, I mean, you could.
or Reaganomics, depending on your preference.
You could lower the tax rate and the amount of spending. That's not an unacceptable strategy, right?
And borrow more.
No. I mean,
I think that
you could lower both by
lower
X.
tax rates will often produce higher tax yields. This is pretty basic.
No, it's not.
But okay, well then we disagree on that, and we can fight an election over it. And I think I know who will win. But either way, my point now is that yes, it may be that certain things become emblematic of broader political arguments, but I don't think a cake is one of them. I think that on that point, if the extent to which Labour chooses to put their bets behind the notion that Prime Minister will fall because of breaches of rules like that, they'll lose. And they may gain some space in the Twitter sphere. They may gain a great deal, helicopters going overhead in Westminster, as if the Prime Minister's either going to drive to Buckingham Palace after PMQs or do an O.J. Simpson and take off down Whitehall.
That would be good. That would be box office.
I mean, they can whip up the excitement as much as they like, but I'm pretty sure they're going to lose. In the end, these discussions are fought and lost in the, whether you like it or not, with an 80-seat majority on the Tory backbenches. And right now, the Tory backbenches have been unified behind the PM because of political circumstances.
Yeah. Do you agree with that, John? But you think that? No, you don't. You think
No,
it's.
I think the truth is that Labour would like Boris Johnson to stay where he is because they think they can beat him. And Conservatives will realise that, and they will realise that the one candidate that Labour don't want to oppose is Rishi Sunak at the next election because they think they're afraid of him.
My view is that that lion killing is addictive, and if you've taken down one, you think you can take down the next one, and if you show that you can defenestrate a prime minister, the challenge is to do it to the next. Back in the day, this is what David Davis used to say about himself as Shadow Home Secretary. I'm not going to leave this weak Home Secretary in post. I'm going to take that weak Home Secretary down, and then the next one comes along and defeat that one too. There is the notion that an opposition would prefer somebody to stay in post because they can duff them up is almost always wrong. They want to take that person down and then show discontent, disharmony on the other side. They're all at sea. We can beat them up. We're the real opposition. And that's what Keir Starmer wants to be able to show himself as being. And that's why today's PMQs really did matter, because it was a massive opportunity for Labour today. It's hard to overstate the extent
And
to
the
which
previous
PMQs
week, Keir Starmer was pretty
It was
good.
really good.
actually.
Let's be fair. Keir Starmer is sometimes really good at PMQs.
Today he was not.
A word about public opinion, because this is an inside Westminster, and John, you and your colleagues in the lobby will be rehearsing what all the rules are for how a leader of the Conservative Party can be displaced. But obviously, public attitudes filter back pretty fast, right? And I've got a theory here, or a hypothesis, that is a bit like I was asking about whether MPs see this as just a kind of cipher through which they hold their wider concerns. Do you think the British public are a bit similar? That they might say, oh, I don't trust the man in charge anymore, I think he's acted appallingly. But really, in the background, their positivity about the government is based on a kind of subconscious view of their own economic circumstances. If they've received pay rises over the past 2 or 3 years, or see the economy booming, or whatever, good rates of return on their shares, etc., 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 things going well, then these sort of incidents become much more forgivable. Indeed, they might even say anything not quite like the Prime Minister. Really, they're just using those opinion poll questions as a cipher for whether or not they're happy with their lot in life. And if they're not, and it's been a pretty grim 2 or 3 years, then the anger bursts out. But if they were, perhaps it wouldn't burst out in the same way. Perhaps they'd let it slide.
That's a theory that people use opinion polls as a form of running by-election during the midterm of a parliament. They use opinion polls to send a strong message to the government that they don't like what the government's doing. But you've got to make a judgment about that. I mean, 60+% of the British people want Boris Johnson out. and that's not good for him.
So they say to pollsters now.
Yeah, but you've got to make a judgment about whether that 60% can be
That's
or
right.
enough of that 60% can be brought back.
That's right.
And I think if I were a Conservative MP, I would judge that I don't think Boris Johnson's capable of doing that, because he just gets into too much trouble all of the time. And I would just switch to the safe option of Rishi Sunak.
And I would have the opposite opinion, not least because I don't regard any of the other alternatives as a safe option. And you don't know if someone's a safe option until they're in the cauldron. Until they.
But at some point you want to twist rather than stick, right? At some point the odds are you should twist, not stick.
Maybe. Because you only have so far of a political time horizon, right? And so some MPs were in the Thatcher environment, never wanted to twist until the fates determined otherwise, right?
Yep.
And it may be the case for people's opinions on Boris Johnson. Yes, if he was going to be a Prime Minister forever, a prospect that might haunt some people watching, but for some others might seem rather nice. Yes, you might at some point in that environment want to twist. But for the foreseeable time horizon, the known quantity may be better for you than any of the unknowns that you look at.
I thought Boris Johnson did a very good job today of trying to convince his backbenchers that he could turn it around. But I mean, I think as soon as they leave the chamber and think about it, they'll just.
That's interesting. Whether is it just a short shot of adrenaline that doesn't really last the evening, isn't it?
Yeah, but the beauty of a short, sharp shot of adrenaline is that you can have another one. And the point.
You're always going to have some excitement with Boris Johnson, but what you also know is that you're just going to have trouble and you're going to have scandal and. He's just going to create bad headlines.
And what I've never been on the inside of government. I have worked for a political party, the Liberal Democrats, and I'll recount an anecdote about that from back in the day. But what's your sense about how, as these unfold, they just become overwhelming for government? Your bandwidth to deal with anything else, it's all. I mean, we would always say politicians are only thinking about the next 24 hours, but they're almost now thinking of the next 24 minutes, right? And your ability to think through what should our economic strategy be in the budget or whatever, it's just completely crushed, isn't it, once you're dealing with this unfolding crisis management?
I think it's certainly overwhelming for journalists in Westminster. I can tell you that. I mean, the Westminster lobby today was just completely paralysed, waiting for Sue Gray, unable to do anything. But I mean, I think something similar is also happening in government on the other side of the mirror. That it becomes very difficult for cabinet ministers to concentrate and focus on.
Exactly.
On their day.
I think short of something really explosive coming out of either Grey or the Metropolitan Police or both, I think we may have passed peak challenge for the PM on his own backbenches. I think that sometimes you can only see the peak when it's behind you, right? And there was a great deal of criticism against Boris Johnson and all Owen Paterson stuff and the run-up. But then once you had the defection and the sense that Labour really had some momentum on, then I thought that there could really, then that was a time when I thought the challenge was on for the PM. And you saw a good chunk of the Tory party rowing back in behind the PM, including, by the way, some of his most outspoken critics in public who weren't quite saying, Bojo forever, but they were reverse ferreting on some of the positions they'd taken.
I'm going to ask you a question about. I was going to recount back to my days many moons ago when I was working for the Liberal Democrats, and Charles Kennedy's leadership was coming under threat. And I can remember his staff coming to me and sort of saying, "What would you do? What would you do? We're in a real hole here." And my rather uninspired advice was, launch something. But I just wonder whether you have to do that to escape these things. Should he actually sort of try and I mean, often it looks a bit feeble. I think Keir Starmer's tried to relaunch his leadership on several occasions. And sort of say, there's got to be some substance to it. But could the Prime Minister basically say, all right, we're closing this chapter, COVID's behind us, we're now going to do something, here I've got a whole box of tricks here.
Yeah, it's called the Levelling Up White Paper.
Yeah,
and everybody's just going to say, is that the best you can do? And it's not going to change the subject.
So if I take your question for both parties, first of all, I accept the premise that life has been hard for Keir Starmer. Sometimes life's hard for leaders of the opposition. You don't get a fair crack at the whip. I think the right precedent for, you're a man interested in history, I think the right precedent for Keir Starmer is Michael Howard, someone who could absolutely serve as Prime Minister, well qualified, eminent QC. Maybe the times are against him, maybe they're not. This is his time, not a relaunch, but the environment in which he basically looks like he's prosecuting the Prime Minister. That's the time that suits Keir Starmer. He still can't get it right yet.
He's not very good at it.
He's not, but that's the time that suits him. For the Prime Minister and for the government, on the other hand, relaunch is much easier if you've got control of the government purse strings. Now, I agree with John that the white paper on levelling up ain't going to do it, but you and I know what might. Tax cuts.
Well, postponing tax rises.
Well, let's start with that and go on.
As soon as the Sue Gray report is published, I think your friends on the Tory backbenchers are going to get all the goodies they want. They're going to get.
Sounds great.
Postponement of the tax rise. What else don't you like?
I'll give you a few others, and they may or may not go with them. I think national insurance contribution by employers is a tax on jobs. And if you're having a go at national insurance already...
You can't abolish that tomorrow. So.
No, but you can shave it. That's one thing I would have a go at. I think they've already got the licence fee freeze. That'll be cemented.
Yeah.
That's something.
Go to war with the BBC. Good distraction, yeah.
Not just a good distraction. I think that there's a good part of the Tory party that's looking at that and saying, no matter what you think about the BBC, the licence fee as a model is something we can have a go at, right? And that I think there's plenty of people in the media are willing to have a go at as well.
Well, I don't know how it will pan out, but I hope we get. I hope we get a bit of punk Thatcherism. I'd be quite.
I like that.
But I want to move on to another topic, and this might be whether we got things in perspective or not. Ukraine. I am by no means a foreign affairs expert. I simply don't know what to make of it. Talking about the bandwidth, John, our foreign secretary's on the airwaves and is understandably, I guess, being asked questions about has she been to a party or ever been invited to a party, not about the future of NATO or what our relationship should be or how we should defend the Ukraine. What should freedom lovers, John, make of what's unfolding? And are our present sort of institutions, NATO and the rest, up to dealing with this?
Well, it was interesting that the Prime Minister did try to use the Ukraine issue as one reason why his MP shouldn't get rid of him, because he said, we're Great Britain's playing a leading role in leading the West in standing up to Putin,
as opposed to Germany.
Well, yes, which I'm sure is true, but. Given that we're not prepared to put any troops into this, all we can do is point out to Putin, which must be completely obvious to him already, which is that he doesn't want to occupy and suppress a nation as big as Ukraine.
No, but he doesn't.
Determined to assert its independence.
But that's falling into his trap, because I don't think he wants to occupy a nation as big as Ukraine. I think he wants to take a bit of it, and for you to let him get away with it, and then take a bit more, and for you to let him get away with it, and then take a bit more.
It's a very long-term strategy, because
it's worked once. Crimea is basically the international community is willing to let that go. Crimea is part of Ukraine, but the international community has been willing to let that drop, and as you rightly say, the Luhansk and Donbass is basically next, and then what comes after that in the east of Ukraine. Whilst I appreciate, I've turned up looking like the work experience boy who's misjudged the day.
No, a very punk Thatcherite
the
look,
pair of you.
Alex.
I've spoken at a few NATO conferences, and I've been to Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are going to fight, right? They're not going to roll over, and that's when we're going to have to decide where we are and what side we're on. I'm not sure that you're right about saying we're not willing to commit troops. We may not be committing them in a hot war, but we may well commit them as a deterrent to invade.
Do you think that's right? This is going to heat up a lot, do you think, John? Or are we just going to be, complaining from the sidelines, really?
Lead complaining from the side. I mean, there's a leadership role. It is complaining from the sidelines.
Well, that's not much of a leadership role, is it?
Hang on. The Germans, first of all, we didn't ask them for permission, so let's give them credit. We flew around Germany to deliver material, so we didn't have to ask. And then when they find themselves in the awkward position on things like permission for arms exports to old East German military equipment that they had acquired, ironically, from the Soviet Union in the first place, to get via Poland and Estonia to the front, the Germans are dragging their feet on that too. So being a cheerleader from the sidelines is a great deal better than being a detractor from the sidelines. That's my first point. But my second point is that actually the mere presence of American or British troops in that environment could well be a deterrent from military action. And I think Putin, there aren't many things that would give him pause, but the idea of however many, it could be totally nominal, but the idea of rolling over a very small unit of British soldiers would be very different from rolling over a large unit of Ukrainians.
John, I've got I'm running lots of theories by you guys, right? My punk Thatcherite theories. But here's another theory I got.
Was his theory?
No, I'm adopting that one. I'm stealing that. Do we think, in general terms, and we'll see what happens in the Ukraine, that we're finding that quite a lot of international institutions, which may very well have served us well in, say, the 1980s, 1990s, the European Union, NATO, the World Trade Organization, to name three, the World Health Organization back in the day, are being found incredibly wanting. I wonder whether there's a thread or a theme that links these together. Clearly, the World Health Organization and NATO, very different entities. But we seem to have created an international infrastructure for very different times 2 generations ago, haven't really adapted them, and I just wonder whether they're fit for purpose in the 2020s.
I think that's a fundamental problem to do with the nature of international organisations, is that they always operate on the basis of national vetoes. And it is very difficult. I mean, the UN, when it was set up, was a wonderful, idealistic organisation that was never able to deliver its promise. But I mean, it has done a lot of useful things, but it is a large and corrupt and mostly useless body. But it would be better to keep it than to get rid of it.
But my claim, Alex, is a bit stronger. That, the let's say the World Health Organization. Was it smallpox? They're still living off the halo effect of that. COVID, I mean, terrible record. NATO, you might credit with winning the Cold War and liberating Eastern Europe. NATO today, I'm not saying get rid of it, by the way, but just seems clunkier and worse. The European Union, I think, was liberalising trade, you could argue, in the 1980s.
If I canter through the institutions you're slagging off, I think, broadly speaking, I agree with the thrust of your premise. I don't accept that the EU was useful in the 80s or 90s, but I would say, I went to a ball in Vienna by the IAEA, patting itself on the back about atomic restrictions the year that they failed to do anything about Saddam. There are times when you find and Kim Jong-il. There are times that you find these institutions are gloriously self-congratulatory when they shouldn't be. And the WHO, you're right, missed COVID, but then again, so did all its constituent members. I semi-defend actually the WHO on that. And on the point that the two of you were discussing, I don't think that the UN is at League of Nations status yet, but it is circling the car park. It should think carefully about what comes next, because if it wants to make itself more relevant, and I say this contrary perhaps to British interests, you might want to circle the sphere of influence beyond the P5 and whoever gets cycled on, and include some of the new powers in this world and demonstrate that it's got a function. But then you'd have to do something with that function, and not just the Secretary General slagging off capitalism, which was the last thing he did last year.
So we should muddle through, right, John? I mean, I wasn't suggesting scrap NATO. Muddle.
Well, now you're a Tory again. This is wonderful. Now you've joined Boris Johnson's cabinet. Welcome aboard.
Punk Blairite. You don't think there is? I mean, because in some areas, again, not my field of expertise, but the US, Australia, UK deal on defence. I mean, I'm not saying it's an alternative to NATO, and neither of those. But I just wonder whether there are a few straws in the wind that actually new international structures are going to be established, and perhaps these structures will fall into sort of League of Nations disrepair at some point.
Well, possibly. Although, you've got to look back at. NATO did play a very, very constructive role in rescuing Kosovo from Milosevic. I think a lot of these international organisations can still have some kind of role to play, but I think it is a matter of muddling through and accepting imperfection. It's accepting that the Human Rights Council, or whatever it's called, of the UN has got
it's defunct,
Syria
beyond it's absurd.
Saudi Arabia on it.
I think that's right, and I remember one of Reagan's many biographers pointed out that Caspar Weinberger, his defence secretary, would start a fight with you on a dozen different fronts, start a fight with you on umpteen issues. I think, what the hell am I going to do? And he would say, well, look, if you really want to make peace with me, the very first thing you could possibly do, just the smallest thing, is you just give way on this thing. And that's all he wanted.
Right,
That's actually all he was after. But then you thought you'd had a win because the other 11 issues went away. I wonder if Putin's shouting the odds now because he wants a commitment that Ukraine's never going to be in NATO and NATO's expansionist ambitions will be retrenched. And he's going to win that if that's his ambition.
Yeah.
Before I let you go,
I agree with that.
Before I let you go, gentlemen, John, you first. Do you think this whole Ukraine issue, and this has been a feature as well of dealing with COVID, is going to really bring security of supply as a major, energy in this particular case? But I've heard more and more arguments about, steel really is a strategic industry. There's no way we could ever not make steel ourselves. Food, need more homegrown food. Imagine if the foreign suppliers were. Electronics, we can't rely on China as much as we were. Now, as a free trade liberal, I'm very sceptical about those ideas. But do you think that's the direction of travel now, where global free trade is going to get out-trumped by an insistence that there is both diversity and security of supply of the necessities? I think
that's a very interesting question, because I think one of the things about British public opinion is that it's different from public opinion in a lot of other countries. America, for example, every presidential election in America is tainted by protectionism, and that's never been an issue in British politics. I mean, the idea that Britain is an open, free trading nation
is taken as read.
Is just assumed. But you're absolutely right that one by one these issues are sort of salami slicing that assumption. We can't let the Chinese run our nuclear power stations. Not that we have any, not that we're building any new ones anyway. But all that.
Huawei would be the example as well.
All that seems to be a fundamental shift in the sort of assumptions that dominate public opinion in this country.
It's looking pretty bleak for punk Thatcherites, isn't it then, Alex? Do you think global free trade is on the retreat for that reason?
I think global free trade is under real threat, and it always has been from things like the buy local movement, but that was relatively fringe and minority. But the thing, even the left can remind us, and the Eurocentrics can remind us, that fringe positions, like Brexiteering, can become mainstream. And if you don't watch what's happening over time, something that was fringe can become a dominant political narrative, and sometimes times suit those narratives. And I think right now that everything from the sustainability agenda to the COVID agenda to the Ukraine agenda suits buy local, and you can see how these narratives build up to subsidising your farmers, to trying to have a stronger energy policies domestically and so forth. But in answer to your question to John and I about whether that's going to happen in the near to medium term, the Germans abandoned nuclear 10 years ago. They're mothballing power stations that were perfectly good. They started strip mining coal as a result, which was bonkers, but they did so on the basis that in the medium term they were going to have Nord Stream 2 online. Well, in the current environment, that's a very, very hard sell.
John, Alex, pleasure to have you with us on the Live with Littlewood sofa. Thanks very much for your insights, and punk Thatcherism will definitely be something that we talk about here now. John's raised it. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
So punk Thatcherism, that great Rentoulism there. We're going to stick on the Ukraine issue for a bit, but while you're here, if you're enjoying the show, please hit the like button, hit the thumbs up, and if you're not yet a subscriber to the IEA London YouTube channel, please hit that red subscribe button and the notification bell. That will mean that you hear about all of our upcoming content on the IEA London YouTube channel. If in these difficult and stretched times you've got a few pennies spare, please do consider becoming an IEA online patron. Again, details are in the show notes below. For as few as £5 a month, you can help us keep the lights on and hopefully get me a mic that works properly at the top of the show. We'd really appreciate your support. Now, to continue on Ukraine and also to talk to us a little about science, great pleasure to welcome to, I think, his first appearance on the show, Alan Mendoza from the Henry Jackson Society and our very own Dr. Jamie Whyte. Good to see you. Hello. Good to see you. Now, Alan, this is your field much more than the IEA, so you heard our previous guests talking about the Ukraine situation. Try and piece it together to me. What is happening, and what the hell should we be doing about it?
Well, very good question, Mark. And indeed, what is happening? I mean, realistically, that's a question that you should have asked a missing guest, Mr. Vladimir Putin, to have maybe made an appearance. But the reality is that we have a situation where clearly there's a vast troop build-up on Ukraine's borders. And when I say Ukraine borders, I don't just mean in Russia itself, but also Russian-controlled Crimea You've got now Transnistria in the Moldovan part to the west. You've got Belarus, Russian troops there. Basically, you've got an encirclement of Ukraine. Now, we have no concept yet about what that encirclement's all about. Is it about an invasion of Ukraine, which it quite obviously could be, because if you assemble that level of force and that disposition...
But not necessarily.
Not necessarily. So it could be, but it could be something else. It could be, and Mr. Putin says, it's just exercises. What are you getting worried about? But it could be something else. It could be that he's trying to exert pressure on the West. It could be he's trying to exert pressure on Ukraine. It could be that he's trying to test our resolve in various ways. All these things are potential options, and that, I think, is what we're trying to do right now, trying to piece together what the appropriate response should be, and starting, of course, with sending a strong message back.
Jamie, how worried are you about these Russian exercise manoeuvres?
Well, like you, Mark, I'm not really a foreign affairs chap, but I'm not that worried, to be honest. I mean, I can't say I have any great concern about Ukraine. Maybe I'm heartless, but... And I also think there's some, I mean, as I understand, Crimea is largely Russian-speaking, and they weren't that hostile to the intervention. You know, a lot of, provided it doesn't lead to a war, I'm not terribly concerned, and I don't think it'll lead to, a major war involving us. And I don't think it will, so I don't lose sleep over it. But maybe I'm just naive.
Is Jamie being far too relaxed about this?
I would suggest so. I mean, I think in 2022, if you want to allow people to go, yeah, I quite fancy a bit of you as a neighbour, that's not a sensible thing to be doing in the European neighbourhood, number one. I mean, not anywhere, but in the European neighbourhood in particular. Number two, given who Putin is and what he aspires to, his own global aspirations, his regional aspirations, there are clearly problems with feeding the beast, as it were, to encourage him to go further. What if he carves up Ukraine and then says, I'll have a bit of Poland next?
No, I'm not disagreeing with any of that. I thought Mark was asking me if I was personally worried.
And you're not expecting to be conscripted or anything like that? No, okay, well, that's reassuring.
There could be some bad outcomes for a lot of people. In fact, I can't really see any good outcomes coming. But so I wasn't answering the right question. I mean, I'm of the view that I don't study this stuff, but I'm of the strong deterrence kind of view, and I think that you should react reasonably aggressively to these kinds of things for the reasons you said. I mean, if you don't, you just get this kind of creeping. So what speaks quietly, but hold a big stick.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Is that your prescription then, Alan? I mean, what should we be doing about this? Our very own Steve Davies has done a video about this and has written about it. And his fear, amongst many others, is actually we will, rather than quietly holding a big stick, we will very noisily wave a twig and say this must not happen, thou shall not pass. But when push comes to shove, do nothing. The exact reverse of Jamie's suggestion.
No, exactly. I think we're in agreement on this. The reality is, yes, you want to make quite clear what you're doing without necessarily shouting it from the rooftops, and you do that simply by private discussions where you outline what happens, and equally you move your own troops into positions which aren't in any way construed as offensive, but are defensive positions in order to maintain that there is a deterrent factor. The key thing to this is deterrence from day one. You've got to send a very strong message that we are going to deter this, we're not going to allow it to happen, but you don't want to shout too much because it also provokes what we've seen, unfortunately, in Europe, which is other countries going, oh, we don't much like the sound of this shouting, we're going to run in a different direction, like the Germans, for example.
One of the things that I lament about politics over the last, or government spending over the last, 20, 30 years, is that countries, my own New Zealand, they're just unwilling, governments are unwilling to spend much on the military. And, only really the United States does, and of course China and Russia do as well as a percentage of GDP. And continental European countries spend a pittance, Britain doesn't spend as much as it once did. And all of this, you might say, well, I think that's one of the fundamental functions of government is to protect us from external aggression. And, they'd rather spend it on all sorts of silly projects that aren't their proper function. And, of course, you just encourage aggressive countries. If they can see you running down your military, they become encouraged. So I think we've pursued the wrong policy agenda now for a long time in Europe. I asked my previous guest this, what should, we're not a foreign affairs think tank by any means, in fact it's probably one of the only areas we don't typically cover, but what should somebody, pro-liberal, pro-freedom, pro-Western capitalism,
beliefs make of our present international institutions? You know, do you think that we've potentially, if you were critical of the way we're handling it, is it just that we've got bad leaders? You know, Joe Biden doesn't know what he's doing, or is it actually that we don't now have structures that are fit for purpose, that we've built, we built NATO to deal with the USSR, not Russia under Putin's on a completely different level. Certainly I'm not really sure what our security is against terrorism or rogue states. We haven't built an international security institutional framework to deal with that. The WTO is running in the ground. I've got this sort of theory that our international institutions might not be fit for purpose. That's not to absolve bad decisions made by political leaders, but I sort of worry even if good decisions are made by political leaders, they're not necessarily doing it through the right framework. Should we just kind of reboot the world and its global international institutional infrastructure?
Well, that's a dream, isn't it? I mean, the reality is, you're right. Look, all these institutions are dated institutions in the sense that they were created in a very different world. I mean, the world of 1945 is incomparable to what we have today, basically. So from that perspective, we're at a situation where we are dealing with still the politics of the victors of World War II, which are determining much of our international institutions. And yes, we've accommodated other powers along the way there, but we are living with the foibles of that world. We're living in the foibles of still the Cold War infrastructure of vetoes and of, you two powers, the most powerful ones, will all follow behind your alliances in that way. There is a leadership issue, definitely is, because I think, some of these strictures were apparent, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago even. It was quite obvious there were some problems along the way, but they've been magnified by the fact that we are in a very different age now. And I think we have to be, cognizant of that. And we're not going to get agreement, are we? Russia and China are not going to agree with us on how to reform these things. So it may well be we'll have to create new institutions and accept they won't be universal in quite the same way.
Jamie, what's your thought of that?
Well, I just want to add one characteristic, I think, of organisations like this, which is that after a while, they start working for themselves rather than their real purpose. So they get filled up with bureaucratic types, and you can imagine the kind of people who go and work in them. And they're then interested in maintaining themselves, enlarging themselves. They don't particularly care about achieving the results they were intended to achieve. And so they kind of get a life of their own. And I think there's a natural tendency for organisations, bureaucratic organisations, to become less and less effective. And that's one argument in favour of just stripping.
So they become less effective, but they're also self-sustaining by their nature.
Yes, and they're harder and harder to get rid of. So I think it would be very difficult to do, partly because you wouldn't get international agreement, but also because the organisations themselves would really obstruct it.
I want to move on to another topic, and this is much more in the IEA's wheelhouse. We're calling this section Omi-conned. Is it time we treated scenarios with more scepticism? Now, I need to be very careful what I say here, because there's a danger that when you start, poking at the establishment and saying it's all junk science, then you're a denier of this and a denier of that. But I think that the evidence suggests that we are probably allowing too many scenarios by experts to actually set our policy. Modeler mistakes about COVID in the summer and autumn of 2021 definitely threw seeds of doubt into the Prime Minister's mind. SAGE, their scenarios for Omicron, but the expected range of deaths at 600 to 6,000 a day by mid-January. The actual number is about 200, a third of their bottom area. Alan, let me start with you, because I think this applies to vast numbers of fields of policy. That you get people who are legitimate experts, right? Neil Ferguson knows more about epidemiology than I do and how to model it. I'm not saying he doesn't. But we're then told to follow the science as if there is a perfect answer that these brilliant men and women can give us. And actually, turns out oftentimes that their guesses aren't much better than throwing darts at a dartboard while you're blindfolded.
You're absolutely right, and I think it ties in and say this is in the IEA's wheelhouse. The IEA will know this from economists. I always like to say about economists, they're the only profession where you can be more wrong than right and still be considered a world expert in that kind of area. Because there is no science to the forecasting process. Yeah, you can go, I'm going to put this and that in. But as we all know, human behaviour is part of the most important changes that cannot be forecast. We don't know when we make a forecast in either economics or, for example, in modelling for pandemics, as to the human nature aspect, we can go based on this and this, and on the virulence we can say this will happen, but then you don't take into account the human factors. It's always forgotten, and as a result we should always be going, right, well these are the guidelines, and as decision makers they should be looking at this and going, these are the clear guidelines, but we have to take this with a you know, sort of pinch of salt. The other thing is, we've already seen previous modelling gone wrong in this whole process. So while at the very beginning you can perhaps say, it's a new situation, we're all completely at sea here, let's just take the expert's view. 2 years in, you've got to go, well, we've seen the experts haven't quite got it right. So let's look at this from the point of view of what is reasonable from the basis of what they're saying versus lived reality.
Jamie, what's your view on this? You and I have discussed this a good few times. I mean, my solution is to force these experts to bet on the outcome of their predictions or have their salary attached to that if you're working for the government. Right, this is what I actually predict is going to happen. And the closer I am to the closer I am to well, not necessarily bonus, 100% commission. You know, the closer I am to being right, the more I'll be paid. Because, but there's an unfairness on them as well, isn't there? They might be asked, well, what's the worst case scenario? And even if they're not asked that and they sketch out best case, medium case, worst case, there's a tendency for people to report the worst case scenario. You know, if all of these things go wrong, it will be X, and you've got a scary headline based on a 400-page document in which this was only one paragraph. What are we to make of the experts, and how should we treat them?
Well, getting them to bet is a very good device for, not necessarily for getting the right answer, but for getting them to be honest. So they're going to bet, if they don't really believe that what they're saying is the most likely outcome, they're going to lose money in the betting market. So betting is a good way of getting people to be honest about what they really believe. So I think that would be a good idea. In fact, I think it would be good. I wrote an article many years ago suggesting that politicians should be forced to bet on the things they say. And then it would really, they'd stop saying them. Because they bullshit, to use, it's actually a technical term, bullshit, in philosophy. There was a philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, who wrote a book called On Bullshit. And what he meant by people who are bullshitters is that they talk, and they're not really interested in whether or not what they're saying is true. They're interested in something else. And so politicians are generally bullshitters, and it would be good. Now, scientific modelers...
Modelers less so, right? I get that from politicians. Does it sound right? I've got to appease the electorate, but there's no reason why, I don't know, Chris Whitty is going to make something up, is there?
I don't think he is I don't think those people are bullshitters. I think other things are going on, but there's still some very peculiar things going on. So, for example, I'm still not clear, after reading about all this stuff, whether what they're doing. Are these forecasts? Are they just possibilities? Of course, everything's possible. You know, what's going on? Are they telling us this is our best estimate of what's actually going to happen if there's no intervention, if there is an intervention, and so on? So it's not clear to me what they're doing, and the betting market would make it clear. Now, I think the important thing, though, to really people to get their heads around is not all branches of science are equally accurate or predictive. They just can't do it.
Sure.
Right? So you may be...
Whereas Alan's point, especially when it's based on human behaviour. If I drop this bottle to the ground, we can pretty much, predict what's going to happen. But once you've got millions of human beings involved and you're second guessing whether they're likely to stay at home or likely to break the rules or...
Some elements of human behaviour are quite predictable. For example, you can model traffic flows quite well. That's human behaviour, right? How people respond to various things. Some elements of human behaviour aren't as predictable, and there are some things that aren't human behaviour that aren't very predictable, such as the climate. Because these are very open systems. Climate's a very open system. All sorts of things can affect it that aren't themselves climatic. And that's why economics is so difficult to do predictions in, because economics is an open system. So if there's a natural disaster, let's say, that can affect economic outcomes, even though it's not an economic event, and so it can't be included in economic models. So there are all sorts of reasons that modelling can be stronger or weaker. And macroeconomic forecasting is very weak. And it turns out that epidemiological modelling is pretty weak. I hadn't known that. I've discovered that during the course of things. And I discovered also that one of the reasons is that they don't pay enough attention to how people respond. So apparently in some of these models, there are no variables for that. Right? They don't take any account of it at all. But what's interesting is they always get it wrong in the same direction. I mean, economists, interestingly, get it wrong in both directions.
Yes.
Both more optimistic and more pessimistic.
But public health modellers always think things are worse than they are.
Which makes me very suspicious, right?
Yeah. What's your reading of that? Is that fair? I mean, I think you're quite right, Alan. I mean, the IEA doesn't do economic forecasting as such because it does just seem to be pretty random. I mean, especially when you're getting to the last decimal point. I mean, I'd hazard a guess that, our GDP will be higher in the region of about 20% in about 10 years' time. But the minute you're getting, experts thought that GDP was going to go up 0.35 this quarter, and it's now gone up 0.4, and even those stats are then revised. It's ridiculous. You're arguing about how many angels there are on a head of a pin, and there's no way you can even, measure the pin.
Yeah, I'm actually struck with what Jamie said at the end there about they don't seem to have any variables for these aspects, and part of that is, if you remember at the start of the pandemic, and we were told by numerous people, the people won't tolerate restrictions, etc. They'll all misbehave within 5 minutes. And it turned out that everyone was far more, maybe shockingly, compliant than anyone realised. So based on that, they should have realised, actually, people are more likely to, even if down the line they're going to go a bit more sceptical as they go, not again, not again. But seemingly, there's a large body of people who are willing to be compliant. So why isn't that not baked into the rules from day one? I think
or it could have meant that guidance was issued rather than legislation.
Because people were going to follow 2 years into a pandemic. They're going to go, all right, we know what happens if we may not follow this. We'll follow the guidance because we think it's broadly sensible.
I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but I mean the nudge unit is involved in the policy making, and they of course devote themselves to trying to work out how people respond to various incentives from the government or suggestions and nudges and so on. But I think that their work was separate from the epidemiological modelling. I think so. They don't integrate the models. And anyway, even if they had, it probably would have been disastrous because the nudge unit have performed very poorly. And indeed, that whole area of behavioural economics is beset by a replication crisis. So that's a very dodgy...
What's a replication crisis?
Do you know about the replication crisis? Or some of the very seminal experiments that are the foundation of the thinking can't be replicated.
Right.
And it's people are running through the whole thing now, trying to check it all out.
What was an example?
I can't off the top of my head think of them. Some of the very famous. It was all the stuff about loss aversion, which is the principal part of it. The fact that we dislike losses more than we like equal gains.
So if you take something away, you're furious. If you give somebody something, you're only marginally grateful.
There's a word for this, I'm forgetting. Yeah. But anyway, it's really foundational stuff in the areas being questioned now. But the thing that I also, it comes back to your point about how you can be a famous economist even though you're wrong more often than you're right. When I wrote Quack Policy, the very last part of it, I'm discussing what makes something scientific. And the standard view is that the difference between superstition and science is that science is testable. You have hypotheses that you can test with observable data. And that's right. But there's another way in which I think people can fail to be scientific, which is that when they have a theory and it is tested and it's shown to be false, and they just shrug their shoulders and go on. I mean, they don't care that their theory has been refuted. I mean, astrology...
What's an example of that, then?
Well, all these epidemiologists, I mean, they keep getting it wrong by miles, and they keep peddling, as far as I can tell, they use the same old models to give us new forecasters, but hang on, your model's been shown to not work, to be wrong. Economists are the same macroeconomic forecasting, relentlessly wrong, and they just stick at it.
What's the solution to that, Alan? I don't want to sound too mean-spirited here. These are goddamn difficult things to predict, and oftentimes important things to predict, right? We want to know whether there's going to be a climate disaster, whether hundreds of thousands of people are going to be afflicted by a pandemic, even whether the economy is going to grow by, 2% or 4%. But what would be the way, without being mean-spirited about it, to punish the people who get it wrong rather more firmly?
I'm not necessarily sure you wouldn't need to punish them as such. I think it's more a case of, to echo Churchill's words, doctors and lawyers are there to advise. They're not there to make the decisions for you. So it's perfectly possible to have those models playing out, people making the models, but politicians and others going, right, I understand what your role is. Your role is to give me this view, and I can set the questions, and you'll give me a view. It's rather like when you ask a lawyer a question. How you ask the question is very important, because it will give you a different answer in that sort of way. So you have to ask the question sensibly. You have to then understand the data that comes to you, and then you've got to make your decision based not simply on that, but on the other factors that are beyond the realm of what those people are paid to do, basically. And that involves bringing in other data to then make your collective choice. Now, it can be difficult, but that's what leadership is about. Leadership is sometimes about saying, I've got this information, but I'm actually putting other information together with it, and that's what's going to make my decision.
Really interesting, but aren't there different types of experts here? I'm thinking aloud here, but from just what you've said, doctors and lawyers. My experience with lawyers is it's nearly impossible to extract an opinion from them, right? So how much is this likely to cost me? It could be anything. Am I going to win or lose? Well, who knows? Very, very reluctant to give an opinion, which might be wise advice, but I'm looking for certainty as a client and they can't provide it. Doctors, emphatic, same opinion every time. Every affliction I've got, I need to smoke and drink less, right? Very, very clear. I don't know if they're right, but very, very clear. But in the case of a doctor, you would sort of say, well, he's going to have a better analysis. He's going to know much more, right, than I do. And you'd say that about an epidemiologist as well. How can a politician say, well, here are all the experts telling me this disaster of X will happen, whether it's a pandemic or climate change. But you know what? That's only advice. And I, the leader of Party X, have, consulted my tarot cards or spoken to the missus, and she doesn't much believe it. So we're not embracing that advice.
There was a book written recently. I can't remember the author or the name, but Steve Baker was banging on about it for a while, called about expert error and how to avoid the problems with the experts getting things wrong. And one of the suggestions that he made is that you shouldn't have all the experts being from the same school of thought on the topic. So there are rival epidemiologists. So, there are some quite famous epidemiologists, the ones who got involved in the Great Barrington Declaration, who have a different outlook.
Yep.
And what you want to do when you're forming these committees, like SAGE, is make sure that you've got diversity of opinion within the experts. I mean, in all of these science areas, in physics, and not the edges of physics, in mainstream physics, there's perfect agreement between all the scientists. But in all these areas, like economics and epidemiology, there's disagreement. And you should get disagreeers into your group. That's very important.
And just on that point, it actually ties in something at the beginning of the pandemic. Do you remember we were all told, you can't possibly say that there was a laboratory leak that caused this from happening. All the science says that it was from the animal market in that sort of way. And it turned out they were only talking about certain scientists that felt that and weren't looking at the whole grouping out there of many people who were saying, well, actually, hang on, there are all these things going on. So as usually, it is about, diversity of thought within the expert panel, because that will lead you to having those alternative sources for you to go, I've weighed it up and on balance, I'm with X rather than Y.
Do you think you could, really interesting, Alan, do you think you could ever really find, you're talking about the powers, the qualities of leadership, an objective politician who would really make that decision? Or do you famously get into the Harry S. Truman position when he sort of thumped the table and said, will somebody please bring me a one-handed economist, right? And sort of and I wonder whether you get into a situation where even subconsciously the political leadership know the result we want. We want to show either that there is a climate crisis or there isn't one. To suit our policy agenda. We've decided because, we're going to go for this gangbusters and therefore we need lots of evidence, and if we don't do this and if we don't tax that, then, the apocalypse will unfold. Or similarly, we've decided we're going to, cut tax on fuel and, we want to rebuild the petrol industry, so we want the evidence that there isn't a problem. Isn't that sort of baked in, that we're just not going to get objectivity by having a committee of scientists of different schools of thought, or hoping that our political leaders are some sort of virtuous, objective people who will weigh in the round as if they're on a jury? They've already decided, haven't they?
I think it depends on the issue, doesn't it? I mean, I think there are some issues that politicians have decided. A politician on the left will probably go X and Y on this subject. A politician on the right will say no, A and B, because that's just what's baked in. But when we're talking about the pandemic, something that was genuinely new to us. We hadn't seen something like different sort of problem. And I agree you can come to some areas where you'll have that sort of inbuilt resistance, but other places you're genuinely going in a spirit of seeking information and then making a decision based on the information. And so it's very much, in my view, an issue by issue thing. And sometimes you'll be seeing in history, there have been examples, of course, about people, maybe even conviction politicians coming in who are willing to challenge a massive consensus. I mean, the obvious example of Britain is Margaret Thatcher. For 30 years, we'd all decided that Britain would decline, essentially. We'd follow these economic policies, whether they worked or not, that's how we'd do it. It was going to be that way. And yes, she had an idea she was going to change it. How she was going to change it, of course, was thought up along the way. But, you do get that, but you've got to be open to ideas about things.
How do we keep people open-minded, objective, and also on my side?
Well, I think that the foundation of the kind of political philosophy that I adhere to, the Hayekian kind of one, is based on recognition of our ignorance. So you go, well, we don't really understand society well enough to fine-tune it. But we do know some basic stuff, some basic rules of thumb. And you would have to have something quite extraordinary and obvious, very great threat, like the German army massing across the Channel, before you start doing things like locking people in their homes. And so you've got a profound bias in favour of liberty based on the history of mankind. And then you say, well, it's going to take an awful lot to knock us off that course. And I don't think COVID past was clear enough. And it was interesting. People said, well, we don't know what we're dealing with here. Indeed, we didn't know what we're dealing with. That's true. So therefore, we should lock everyone in their houses. I say we didn't know what we're dealing with here. So therefore, we shouldn't lock everybody in their houses. That's about as good as it gets, right? And that's why you'll say, well, the left's always going to lock you in your house. And I mean, you'll notice that people on the left were much keener on the lockdown than people on the...
Well, they have much greater faith in state diktat.
Well, exactly. And they believe in experts and the ability of experts to fine-tune society for the good of mankind. And people, conservatives and libertarians, I think, are both sceptical about that. Or at least a certain strand of libertarianism is. Conservatives are certainly sceptical about that. And I think we're really seeing fundamental issues play out here, but I don't give too much credence to experts to sort out our lives for us.
Interesting. Alan, I'll finish with you. Does that mean that we should be looking for political leaders who we agree with on their instincts rather than on a published manifesto or a particular pledge to do X, Y or Z? That actually whatever one's political philosophy, whether you're on the kind of free market liberal side or the other side of the aisle, is that what we should actually be looking for? Somebody with instinct rather than pledges?
Isn't that really what we're doing, Mark, realistically? I've rarely met a voter who's gone, do you know what, I really studied the manifestos in great depth. And on page 64 of the Conservative one, I agreed with this one. But page 58 of Labour's, gosh, that really... No, I don't think people do that in the real world. I think the political pundits go, ooh, eye-catching pledge there. I think most people have a sense on the instincts. I like that Boris, I like that Keir Starmer. Whatever it is, there's something there that connects on a visceral level and makes me want to go and vote. Yeah, occasionally it's about the issues. I really hate one policy or another policy, I'm going to vote on that. But I think actually people are quite sensible about these things. They go and they look at, the old, in a sense, the old pub test. Who would I rather go down and have a drink with? Not what policies, but who do I trust on that basis?
Kind of wisdom of crowds, really. And that's what makes democracy function. We've run over time, so we have to wrap up. Jamie, Alan, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to my previous guests, we've sorted out the future of the British government, the future of our Prime Minister, what we should be doing on the Ukraine, how to completely reset all international institutions, and the precise objective way we should deal with expert opinion in future. Not bad for just over an hour. So I hope you've enjoyed the show. If you had, please hit like. If you're not a subscriber yet, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. And if you've got a few pennies or pounds spare, please do consider becoming an IEA online patron. Details are in the show notes below. There's a whole load of content coming up on the IEA London YouTube channel over the coming days and weeks. Live with Littlewood will be back in 2 weeks' time from Sri Lanka, where I'll be then. I don't know what the COVID restrictions are there, but I do know pretty certainly it's sunnier than it is in London. So please do join me in 2 weeks from Sri Lanka.